On the 11th of July, 1979, a lawyer named Giorgio Ambrosoli spent his evening talking to American investigators. He had good reason to talk. For years, this man had been quietly taking apart one of the biggest financial frauds in Italy. He had reconstructed it piece by piece. And that night, he handed a foreign government the evidence. A few hours later, Giorgio Ambrosoli arrived home. It was late. Outside his apartment in Milan, 3 men were waiting for him in the dark. They shot him, right there on his own doorstep, and then they disappeared into the night. The man who had ordered his death was a banker. A financier the newspapers of Rome had once called a genius, and that banker was the very same man who, a few years earlier, had introduced Roberto Calvi, God's banker, to the financial power of the Vatican. If you want to understand how a Catholic bank ended up with a body under a London bridge, you have to understand the people Roberto Calvi chose to stand beside. Today, we meet 3 of them. This is the Veritas Brief, the podcast from Veritas Europea, where we take one story from European power, finance, or political economy, and we slow it all the way down. We are reader-funded. We carry no advertising from outside sponsors. That independence is the whole reason we can spend an episode like this one following the money into places most outlets simply will not go. This is the second part of our special investigation into the rise and fall of Banco Ambrosiano. In the first part, we stood under Blackfriars Bridge in London, where Roberto Calvi was found hanging in June of 1982. We watched the official suicide verdict quietly fall apart, and we met Calvi himself, the secretive, meticulous banker who climbed for 24 years to the top of Italian finance, and then went looking for a partner more powerful than any regulator. Today, we meet the men he found. There are 3 of them. A Sicilian financier who taught Calvi the game and died drinking poisoned coffee in a prison cell. An American archbishop who turned the Vatican's own bank into something extraordinarily useful to men like Calvi. And a former fascist who ran a secret lodge that reached into the very top of the Italian state. Let us start with the Sicilian. His name was Michele Sindona. He was born in Sicily in 1920, the very same year as Roberto Calvi. He trained as a tax lawyer, and after the war, he moved north to Milan. And there, he began to build. By the mid-1960s, Michele Sindona had assembled a financial empire that spanned 9 countries. It reached into real estate, into steel, into food processing, into banking, and the newspapers of Rome had a word for him. They called him a financial genius. But we should be careful with that word, because some of the people calling Sindona a genius did not mean it as a compliment. They meant it as a warning. Here is why he matters so much to our story. By the time Sindona met Roberto Calvi, he had already built something Calvi desperately wanted: close working ties to the finances of the Vatican. And Sindona made an introduction. He introduced the younger banker to a man named Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the American cleric who ran the Vatican's own financial institution. We cannot overstate how much that single introduction reshaped Italian banking history. Because it solved a problem for everyone in the room. Sindona wanted access to Calvi's growing institution. Calvi wanted the credibility that only the Vatican could lend him. And Marcinkus, the archbishop, well, he seems to have found the whole arrangement rather useful too. But before we follow that thread into the Vatican, we have to watch what happened to Sindona himself. Because Sindona is not just the man who made the introduction. He is the warning that Italy chose to ignore. Sindona's empire collapsed first, years before Calvi's did. At the center of it was an American bank, Franklin National Bank. At one point, Franklin National had been the 20th largest bank in the entire United States, and in October of 1974, it failed. At the time, it was the largest bank failure in American history. What brought it down? Bad currency bets, fraudulent accounting. And when it fell, it did not fall alone. The Vatican itself is estimated to have lost around $30 million in the wreckage. Now we want you to sit with the timing here, because this is the part that should have changed everything. The pattern that would eventually destroy Banco Ambrosiano, the reckless bets, the cooked books, the Vatican quietly exposed to the losses. That pattern was already visible. It was sitting there, in plain sight, in the ruins of Michele Sindona's empire. 8 years before Calvi's own collapse. The warning could not have been clearer, and Italy looked straight past it. And then there is the matter of the man who tried to sound that warning. His name was Giorgio Ambrosoli, the lawyer we met at the very top of this episode. Ambrosoli was appointed to liquidate Sindona's failed banks. That is a dry, technical job. It means going through the wreckage and figuring out where the money went. But Ambrosoli did it properly. He spent years reconstructing the fraud in detail, and eventually, he handed the United States Department of Justice the evidence that would help convict Sindona. Michele Sindona did not forgive him for that. On the 11th of July, 1979, just hours after Ambrosoli had briefed American investigators, 3 mafia gunmen were waiting outside his home in Milan. They shot him dead on Sindona's orders. There is a detail here we cannot leave out, because it tells you something about the political world all of this happened inside. Giulio Andreotti was one of the most powerful politicians in Italy, a towering figure in the Christian Democrat Party and a close associate of Sindona. Years later, Andreotti was asked about the murder of Giorgio Ambrosoli, and what he said has followed him ever since. He described Ambrosoli, the honest liquidator gunned down on his doorstep, as, and we quote, a person who, in Romanesque words, was looking for it. Looking for it. That was how the death of an honest man was waved away at the very top of Italian politics. As for Sindona himself, the ending is grim, and it is fitting. Italian authorities extradited him in 1984. 2 years after that, a court convicted him of ordering Ambrosoli's murder and sentenced him to life in prison. 4 days after that sentence, Michele Sindona drank a cup of coffee in his prison cell. It had been laced with cyanide. He collapsed, and within hours, he was dead. To this day, investigators have never conclusively established whether Sindona poisoned himself or whether someone else did it for him. He had spent his final years surrounded by men with every possible reason to want him silent. And that ambiguity, that permanent unanswerable question, was, in its own way, exactly the outcome those men needed. Sindona showed Calvi the game. Now let us look at the institution that made the game possible. We are going to pause here for one moment, because we need to ask you for something. The Veritas Brief, and everything we do at Veritas Europea, runs on one thing and one thing only: our readers and our listeners. We do not sell ads to outside sponsors. We do not answer to advertisers. When a story leads us into the Vatican, or into a mafia contract killing, there is no one upstairs who can tell us to drop it. That independence has a price, and the people who pay it are people like you. So if this is the kind of work you want more of, the slow kind, the careful kind, the kind that spends an entire episode getting one dangerous story right, then here is how you help. Go to veritaseuropea.eu and sign up. Start with the free newsletter. It costs you nothing, and it is the best way to keep the work coming. And if you are able to become a paying member, understand what you are really doing. You are not buying a product. You are keeping a newsroom independent. Think of it less as a subscription and more as patronage. veritaseuropea.e-u. The link is in the show notes. Now, into the Vatican. The Vatican's own bank carries a name that is almost aggressively boring. It is called the Istituto per le Opere di Religione, the Institute for the Works of Religion. Nobody actually says that. Everyone simply calls it the IOR, or, more plainly, the Vatican Bank. Pope Pius XII created it in 1942, and it was built on a very particular foundation: the sovereignty that the 1929 Lateran Treaty had already granted to Vatican City. That word, sovereignty, is the key to everything that follows. Because that treaty is the reason the IOR sits outside Italian tax law, outside Italian banking supervision, outside the reach of Italian courts. Hold that thought. A bank inside Italy that Italy cannot tax, cannot inspect, and cannot prosecute. Now, who ran this remarkable institution? From 1967 onward, the IOR was run by Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, and Marcinkus was, on paper, an almost absurd choice for the job. He was a big man, 6'4", a Lithuanian-American who had grown up in Cicero, Illinois, and he had no formal training in banking. None. In finance, none. What he had instead was physical presence and nerve. Marcinkus had made his name as a kind of papal bodyguard. On a visit to Manila in 1970, he physically shielded Pope Paul VI from a man lunging at him with a knife. And it was that physical courage, that usefulness in a crisis, far more than any financial credential, that lifted Marcinkus into the Vatican's inner circle. A bodyguard, running a bank. But here's the thing. What Marcinkus lacked in banking expertise, the IOR made up for with something no ordinary bank possesses: its sovereign status. Let us lay out what that actually meant, because it is the heart of the whole scheme. The Institute answered to no external regulator. It published no meaningful accounts. It paid no taxes. Now think about that combination from the point of view of a man like Roberto Calvi. If you are trying to move money quietly, past a nation's controls, and you need banks around the world to trust that money, then an institution that keeps no public books and answers to no regulator is not a problem. It is an asset. It is extraordinarily valuable. And Calvi understood that value immediately. Of course he did. Michele Sindona had just introduced him to the Archbishop. So the relationship deepened, and it deepened fast. The IOR became a shareholder in Banco Ambrosiano itself, the Vatican Bank, holding a stake in Calvi's bank. And Marcinkus went further. He personally took a seat as a director of one of Ambrosiano's subsidiaries based in the Bahamas. Read that carefully because it matters. It meant the Archbishop was lending his own name and the towering prestige of the Vatican directly to the offshore structure that Calvi was quietly building. Now, to this day, people argue about how much Marcinkus really understood. Did he grasp where all of this was heading? That question is genuinely disputed. But there is a second question that is not disputed at all, and that is whether Marcinkus benefited from not asking too many questions. He did. Clearly, he did. So we have the pupil, Calvi, we have the teacher, Sindona, and we have the sovereign institution, the IOR. There is one piece left, and it is the strangest of them all. His name was Licio Gelli. He was born in Tuscany in 1919, and his story starts on the far right of European politics. As a young man, Gelli volunteered for Mussolini's Black Shirts. He went to Spain, and he helped the fascist side in that country's brutal civil war. After the Second World War, he reinvented himself as a businessman. Textiles, imports, the ordinary machinery of commerce. But that is not what Licio Gelli is remembered for. Because by the 1960s, Gelli had taken control of an obscure little Masonic sublodge. Its name was Pt.2, and everyone came to know it, simply, as Pt.2. Now Pt.2 was not new. It had existed since 1877 as a minor lodge, a quiet place for Freemasons who could not make it to their regular meetings. Unremarkable. Forgettable. Licio Gelli turned it into something else entirely. He took a lodge of a handful of members, and within just a few years, he expanded it to more than 1,000. And he was not recruiting ordinary men. He was recruiting judges, generals, intelligence chiefs, politicians. It became so strange, so clearly outside the normal rules, that Italy's own Masonic authorities eventually expelled Gelli and pulled the lodge's charter in 1976. But by then, it did not matter. Because by then, Pt.2 had stopped being a lodge in any real sense. It had become a fully clandestine network, a secret machine, answerable to one man and one man only, Licio Gelli. And then, in March of 1981, the whole thing burst into the open, almost by accident. Police raided Gelli's villa in the town of Arezzo. They were not even looking for Pt.2, they were chasing evidence in an unrelated fraud case. But what they found in that villa is one of the most extraordinary documents in modern Italian history. A membership list. 962 names. Let us tell you who was on it. Cabinet ministers, sitting members of parliament, the heads of all four of Italy's intelligence and security services, all four. 43 generals, 8 admirals, the police chiefs of the country's 4 largest cities, and 24 journalists, including the editor and the publisher of Corriere della Sera, the single most influential newspaper in Italy. Take a moment with that list, because it is not a guest list for a dinner party. It is a cross-section of the levers of an entire state. The courts, the military, the spies, the police, the press. All of them, quietly, connected through one secret network, run by a former fascist who answered to no one. So where does Banco Ambrosiano fit into all of this? Directly, right at the center. Roberto Calvi was a member of Pt.2. So was Michele Sindona, the banker under the bridge and the financier with the poisoned coffee. Both of them belonged to Gelli's secret lodge, and the money flowed accordingly. Investigators later calculated that Gelli and his network owed Banco Ambrosiano close to $300 million by the time the bank collapsed. That money came out of Calvi's own accounts, and apparently it came with Marcinkus's blessing. Gelli, meanwhile, lived very well on the arrangement. He kept a suite in a 5-star hotel in Rome, and he used his money and his network to build real political ambition. Investigators found a document tied to him. They called it the Plan for Democratic Rebirth. It was, in effect, a blueprint for quietly controlling Italy's political parties, its judiciary, and its press. And this is the moment the whole story changes shape. Because before that raid in Arezzo, you could look at Banco Ambrosiano and see one crooked banker. One man, one fraud, however large. After the Pt.2 list, that reading was no longer possible. The discovery did not just embarrass a few hundred powerful Italians, it reframed the entire affair. What had looked like one banker's fraud now looked like something far bigger and far darker. It looked like the financial engine of a secret network, a network that reached into the parliament, into the military, and into the newsroom of the country's paper of record. The bank was not the whole story. The bank was the fuel. So let us leave it there for this second part. We have met the Sicilian, Michele Sindona, who showed Calvi the game and died with cyanide in his coffee. We have walked inside the Vatican Bank and seen how its sovereignty turned it into the perfect partner for a man moving money in the dark. And we have opened up the Pt.2 Lodge and found nearly 1,000 names reaching into every corner of the Italian state. 3 men, a financier, an archbishop, and a fascist, and a bank sitting at the center of all of them, quietly moving the money. Next time, we follow that money. We look at the letters of comfort, the offshore shell companies, and the moment the whole structure finally ran out of road, and took Roberto Calvi with it. This has been a special episode of the Veritas Brief from Veritas Europea. If you do not want to wait, the full written investigation is on our site right now, veritaseuropea.eu, with the maps, the money trail, and the diagrams that lay all of this out. And if this episode was worth your time, the single most useful thing you can do is simple. Sign up at veritaseuropea.eu. Keep this newsroom independent. We will see you next time.